Our keynote speakers here, Kerry Enright, is an associate professor in the School of Education at UC Davis. I learned about her work from a colleague who works at the University of Nevada, Reno, who's a second language specialist, and I asked him who he thought might be good at giving a talk on asset-based education, and he was like, Kerry Enright, if you're lucky. So, glowing recommendations. And of course, she has been nothing but gracious with all of me since accepting. You all have a flyer on the back of your agendas that describes her research program at large, so I won't read that to you. But I do want to highlight two aspects of her work that bear especially on our efforts. And I lost my place. First, there you go. She's written dozens of books, articles, grants, and so on that look particularly at language and literacy assets that every one of our students brings with them into our classes. Second, her research also highlights the ways that language instruction not only systematically fails to build on students' language and literacy assets too often, but in fact often punishes students for being quote-unquote deficient or limited. Notwithstanding the unreasonableness of asking someone to give a talk in mid-August, and the short timeline we gave her to prepare, we asked her in mid-June, Dr. Enright has been nothing but gracious and receptive to our invitation to think about these and to help us think about them together. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kerry Enright.
So first I want to define part of the title, right? So I talk about leveraging communication assets. I have just recently started using this term communication assets. And the way I'm defining it right now, and it's maybe a bit sloppy here, is the language and literacy practices used to convey and interpret meaning and problem-solving skills applied to communication problems. So these are the kinds of things that many of our language minoritized students are experts at, right? And they absolutely can be a foundation for a lot of the things we want learners and writers to do in the writing classroom. The kinds of moves that we make and the problems that we're solving in communication, they're really relevant across contexts. So I know that it's really popular to do these land acknowledgements right now. I don't know how many of you have some discomfort with them. I feel like it's someone stealing my purse and then making a nice statement about it. And so I'm going to do a quick acknowledgement of harm that we are on lands that white colonizers stole from people, currently known as the Muwekme Ohlone. The native peoples who survive continue to bear the legacies of this harm, and we who sit here today or stand are profiting from it. I actually have colleagues who've introduced me to ways to contribute to reparations. There are organizations and communities and tribes that actually are asking for contributions, and so I've got a couple of suggestive links for folks here. So I start every course that I teach, every syllabus, whatever I can with this "you belong here" statement. Okay, it varies a little bit from context to context. Usually when I'm in a classroom, I would have folks each read a line as we move through the classroom. I'm going to read it for you here today to establish how I see the space that we're in and the importance of having everyone in it. So you belong here. We belong here if we see ourselves as writers or poets or hacks who can't string together words on a page. We belong here if schools and society have crapped on us and our community. We belong here if we're Sikh, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, secular humanist, pagan, atheist. We belong here if we're documented, or undocumented. We belong here if we're people of color or white or mixed or perceived to be a bunch of things that we're not. We belong here especially if we're still figuring out what and who we are. We belong here if we have a visible or invisible disability, are neurodivergent or neurotypical, if we identify as gender nonconforming or LGBTQIA, or if we're still figuring out what the letters mean, if we grew up speaking like an NBC news broadcaster or our abuelita's language, or we style shift and trans language to communicate our full selves. We belong here if mom was a professor or if we're the first to graduate from high school in our family. Whatever our body type, appearance, talents, abilities, histories, identities, or backgrounds. We belong here if we are, now I'm losing it. We belong here if we're here to learn how to use writing to create a world that is more humane, inclusive, respectful, rigorous, and just in ways that only we can do. Our stories are our skills, and our stories are valued here. So one of the things that I want to point out that I can already see your writing program has in common with probably every writing program in the country is we got a lot of white people here, right? And that's what writing studies is right now. And that is really significant for what we bring and how we're going to understand the talents and the abilities and the experiences of our students, right? So we need to acknowledge that that's a thing in order to learn what we need to learn. And the only people who can really teach us are our students, right? And so I'm going to show you some of what I've learned, starting with my story. So first we're going to figure out what's the theme of our story together today, okay? What problem are we trying to solve? So I hear it's being framed as equity gaps, right, is sort of the broader context of the problem, but I want us to think about how do we define the problem in our classrooms in terms of the practice of teaching and learning, okay? So we'll start with that, then I'll tell my story, the title of which is, What's a White Lady Like You Doing in a Research Space Like This? And then I will share some stories from the experts, and these experts are bilingual Latinx first-gen writers, high school and early university. And then we'll have a little time to sort of extend what we're learning into what would this look like in a university writing classroom, how do we think about using this information that we're getting from students, and then you will extend that afterwards. I'm hoping to hang out and maybe visit a few of the breakouts before I leave. So first, what problem are we trying to solve, right? This is the theme of today's story. I've already said I can't help us with the problem of really large class sizes and course loads that are too heavy and these sort of low pay institutional factors, right? I wish I had the power to help us all with that. But the problem that we're going to look at is this problem of how writing programs and university expectations changed when universities opened enrollment to much more diverse populations of students, starting with returning soldiers and then expanding over time to the rich and talented students that we have in our classrooms now who do not write the way those from the most privileged do, with the ways we teach writing now, right? So I've been on the editorial board of Written Communication since 2006. So I can tell you that what I've seen from the manuscripts that come in and what gets published is that the field of writing studies really is still heavily steeped in composition studies and rhetoric. And then we also have like second language writing as a subfield that I've been involved in also. There is some movement towards thinking about diversity in the classroom differently, but there's still not very much in post-secondary work that is looking at leveraging what learners bring into the classroom. That kind of work in the last 10 years has exploded in high school-based research. We have had scholars of color, and they are leading the work in this stuff, who are doing phenomenal work from a literacy studies, kind of frame, so that they're looking at writing as a situated literacy practice within a context in the classroom and beyond the classroom institutionally, what is setting up the classroom to be this way and teachers to be prepared to move in these ways, and then sociopolitically, what is happening outside the classroom that is shaping whose talents get leveraged in the classroom and whose voices are heard or absent, right? So they're doing absolutely amazing work. We need more. If any of you want to publish some of this work in written communication, like, do this. We need much more in post-secondary. When I was doing my doctorate, I was focusing on bilingual adolescent writing, and at the time, nobody was doing it. So I had to look at early bilinguals who were little kids, and then developmental writers in second language writing at the university level to start to fill that space. So this is the only time I'm going to have you write something down, but I'm going to ask you to take a minute to jot down a few phrases or one sentence that describes how this problem, this challenge, plays out in your classrooms in everyday practices of teaching and learning. So I want you to really imagine, like, I see this thing that's showing up in their writing, or I'm trying to teach this and it's not working, or what exactly are some of the things in your particular classrooms that show up as problems that you think are related to not understanding how to meet the needs of language minoritized students? Do you have just a little bit of something to work with? Okay. So when we do this work, it's really important to figure out where we are locating the problem, right? So here's some examples. These kids come here unprepared for college writing demands. How many of us are like, hell yeah? I personally, like, high schools are not doing their job. High school teachers are not prepared to teach writing, okay? So we could say this and then say, well, the problem is located in K-12 schools, right? Or if we're talking about their families or cultures, of course, some people might locate the problem in that, right? We are too enlightened for that. They don't even speak fluent English, so how can they write it? So now, people from this position are blaming bilingualism or English that is broken or deficient. I understand their point. How many of you have had this experience? I understand their point when they tell me orally, but not when they submit it in written form. Has anyone had that experience? It's like, and so here, we're locating the problem in writers' ability to leverage skills from their oral language into the written language. We're also locating the problem in my ability as an instructor to know what to do with this pattern that I've noticed, right? I have some skills I need to learn. So we want to notice how we are framing the problem. So I'm going to move into my story, and then we will return to writing. So what's a white lady like you doing in a research space like this is a question that I have at least one student of color ask me almost every year. I teach one of the cultural diversity in education classes for undergrads. It's a writing intensive, so there's a lot of sort of writing instruction embedded in that. And then I also always have bilingual Latinx students interning on my research projects. I need that expertise. So I'm from the Boston area. You can't hear it in my speech anymore, but you could have heard me talking about the car, pass the macas, or make sure that you come here, right? So I'm the grandchild of Irish immigrants. On one side of the family, my grandfather was a security guard and my grandma was a housekeeper. And on the other side, grandma was a factory worker and my grandfather was a garage manager. My mom was the first to graduate from high school in her family, and it took significant effort to make that happen. So I'm a first-gen college grad. However, due to our whiteness and the fact that we spoke a variety of English, it only took 2 generations for us to have access to a whole lot of privilege. So I grew up in a suburb very close to Boston, and most of the community, most of the residents of my town were the children. So it was families who had parents who were immigrants or children of immigrants from Ireland Italy, Poland, and Greece. That was predominantly the population. And so my besties actually were mostly bilingual, mostly in Greek. So I can cuss in Greek. This was my elementary school classroom, and then her last name's Xenakis, and here we have Exarchos, right? And for me, I'd go over to their homes, and you know that white people thing of they're talking about me, or why aren't they speaking English so that I can be included? Like, I didn't have that experience. What I saw was intimacy. I saw bilingualism as intimacy. I saw relationship, and I wanted a piece of it. And so that was my initial draw. I think you can imagine the dysfunctions of my own home and childhood as I say that, right? But I really wanted that. And so Spanish was what I had the most access to learning in my high school. I did my undergrad in Maine in a tiny liberal arts college. You can see whiteness in the building, and the student population was just about the same. And I was pretty socially awkward with everyone. I've discovered only in the past year that there's a strong chance I'm autistic. But I was especially awkward with people whom I perceived as different from me. Right? So I didn't think I was better than, but I was like, I don't know how to engage this person. I don't know, right? That sense. And so I was othering. That's what that is, right? Like, they're not a person exactly like I am. I spent a semester in Spain to develop my Spanish. I was the other there. I knew I was freaking smart, but I could not communicate my smartness in Spanish. And the whole time I was uncomfortable there, I knew I had the privilege of being able to go home and get comfortable if I wanted to. And even though I had not had a social justice frame before that experience, when I came back to the US and came back to my mostly white college and started to notice how the others were being treated and positioned, that shifted something in me. And not only did I not identify, but empathize with some of the experiences, but I somehow was able to see the systems that were shaping those experiences for people that I was coming into relationship with. And that is what led me to become a bilingual teacher. So I returned to my old high school as the bilingual program because the school was found out of compliance by the Office of Civil Rights. And I was teaching mostly students who were Dominicanos, so Dominicans. They were black, they were poor, they spoke Spanish, and they had so many dings against them in this community that thought it was inclusive. The district official responsible for their education would white out the district phone number because they knew that if parents had a concern about their kids' education, this was pre-email, when email wasn't, God, I'm old, pervasive. And so they knew if there was no phone number there, these people would just not know how to advocate for their kids, right? My favorite teacher, my AP English teacher who led me into teaching one day, got really frustrated with my kids. Those kids. And she says, you can see they don't care about education. Look at them. They're going home and they don't even have books with them. They don't even do homework. And I was like, yeah, do you know how long I've been fighting for books? I'm teaching 4 different preps, no books, right? Because these kids don't merit them. So again, now I'm getting a sense of such an education in the school where I had a privileged, amazing education. Then I moved to San Leandro High School, anybody East Bay? So there I taught Spanish as a world language, where I saw the most privileged student government kids. 12th grade English non-honors, or college prep as they called it. And so that class had the actual demographics of the school, which was about, at the time, 1/3 black, 1/3 brown, 1/3 white and other stuff, right? And then I was also teaching ELD2 and advanced ELD or ESL. And finally, the students who struggled the most in this school in terms of integrating and knowing the systems were newcomers who took a Spanish literacy class with me. And many of them I also had in the ELD2. Eventually, and they are the ones that I really saw actually make the most progress, which was interesting. But here's the thing that came out of this. The advanced ELD class was new the year I arrived at the school. These kids didn't get an elective, right? They got to take advanced ELD with Miss Enright. And they said, they, meaning, school administration, said, well, they're stalled out. They're these long-term English learners. Their English is stalled out. They're conversationally proficient, but they're not doing well academically. We need to work on academic English. And so I did fun, interesting things with these kids while looking also at the writing of my 12th graders. When I started at the doctorate, I took a lot of classes with John Baugh and Arnitha Ball, who both specialize in what we now call Black language. At the time, it was African American Vernacular English. I pulled out some of my old papers from students, and I discovered that my students, what language does Rocio speak? In advanced ELD, most of my kids were perfectly fluent in Black language. These Mexican origin kids living in Oakland, which most of my students were in San Leandro, they developed the English of the communities in which they lived, and it was Black language. And that's what was showing up in their writing. What that means is that their writing was not very different from a third of the students in my 12th grade English class. Was it appropriate for them to get a special class? It wasn't working, right? But then this wasn't either. You're getting those 12th grade English students, right? That's not working either. So nothing's working. So neither approach, this traditional, here's how we teach writing, or in high schools we don't teach it, we assign it, right? We think it's the same thing. None of that was helping, including students from low SES communities who speak varieties of language that still sometimes struggle in terms of transfer into academic contexts. So I'm just going to post this here. I have a legacy of people from whose work I draw who are not here. My dissertation advisor was Shirley Bryce Heath, and then Andrea Lunsford was on my committee. But then all these other people, right? Guadalupe Valdez I worked closely with, and you'll see some other folks who either I've worked with or I draw on very heavily in my work. And so I want you to hold these names. We'll forward the presentation out because they're really helpful for the frame and for understanding the skills that I'm going to talk about briefly today. How did I learn the stories? I am going to talk to you today about 4 kids coming out of 2 studies, right? One of them is the Hidden Literacies studies. You're getting the bookend of my career. Hidden Literacies was my dissertation project. It involved 10 kids, half of them Latinx bilingual, who were navigating a senior exhibition project for their high school. So I was doing research on kids doing research, right? And I was writing a big thing, and they were writing for them a very big thing, a 15-page paper. And then the Integrating Literacies project is my more recent project, which is working at a high school in Sacramento that only serves students whose families live at or below the federal poverty level. So it's a private high school that has a work-study program that helps to defray their tuition costs and is supposed to be preparing them for the world of career, right? It's a small school. Total enrollment is less than 400 students. And so you'll see some stuff from both of those. So who are the experts that I'm talking about? So here I'm the researcher. In the Hidden Literacy study, Belinda and Lisa I'll focus on today. And they were researchers in their senior X's and researched in my project. And Jessica and Dominic, these are their real names because they actually have co-authored, co-presented. They are high school students. I said there was a work-study program, right? So my research project became their work-study assignment. And so they became full members of the research team. And so I have a lot of expertise that came from Jessica and Dominic and another student, Yadira. For the first project with these 2, there were 10 total students. It was all case studies. For the Integrating Literacies project, I have survey data from 330 kids and then followed 12 for more detail. So So together we had concerns in each project. In the first one, it was about how do we become researchers and writers of research. And the girls in the project knew what I was working on also as a dissertation, and they were like my champions, right? They wanted me to get this right, but they also felt like they were profiting as I asked them questions about their histories and their process in the project. They felt like they were learning more just by reflecting and articulating what they were doing. They could hear if it sounded like something that made sense or if maybe they would want to do something different. In the Integrating Literacies project, I had the beginning of a project, but once I brought youth on the team, they helped articulate new goals and change directions. They wanted to see that school change, not just ivory tower knowledge. They wanted to include as many people as we could in our learning. We together developed and ran a first-year seminar on campus for first-gen bilingual Latinx students and transfers. And then, of course, we were all becoming, I had never done this kind of research, having youth as really colleagues in the project. And they, of course, had never entered this world at all. So again, we were in this together. So this is, you'll hear from Jessica and Dominic, and that's the chancellor of UC Davis, and then Norman and Yadira, who we won't hear from today. So Belinda and Lisa, these are really different writers. Their histories tell us a lot about their writing, okay? So Belinda immigrated as a young child. She, with a single mom and a younger sister. She had most of her education in the US. Her mom couldn't read in Spanish. She learned some Spanish in Catholic catechism classes. Lisa was transnational. She went back and forth. She started in Jalisco, and then her mom divorced her dad, married an American stepdad, moved to Texas. She had a bilingual education. While they were there, the literacy practices in the home were reading materials from the Jehovah's Witnesses and writing letters to dad, who ended up incarcerated. And so those were the main literacy practices. So they went back to Jalisco after that divorce. Mom married another American English-speaking dad and moved to the Bay Area. It turns out they were undocumented during the Texas period, and Lisa had been trained to be very thoughtful about who she shared that with and to be very protective of her history. So I had to develop a lot of relationship with her to get much of this. But we're going to see that all of this is relevant for their writing, which is so fascinating to me. So the story that emerged from that study is that their lived experiences in family, language, and literacy practices shaped their processes and products for the writing of the senior exhibition. And I was surprised to see the extent to which this happened. So their inquiry processes were influenced by their early language socialization, and their written discourse, this was the wildest thing. I'd print transcripts from interviews and then look at drafts from their essays, and their discourse patterns were exactly the same from oral to written. For both of these young people, this was similar with the white kids too, right? It was really interesting how much that relationship is, which is why if we can learn more about our students' oral language practices, we have tools to help them with their writing, and they're really useful ones. So for Belinda, her stuff was all about consensus, typicality, repetition. That's what we see in her writing and in her interviews, the way she'd answer questions. Well, since her mom had limited literacy skills and spoke only Spanish, the way she got information in this new immigrant community was by surveying the community, right? So orally, she would gather information from the people in her social network, and when she'd hear things more than once, that repetition, like that's what you gotta act on, right? So she'd survey lots of people and figure it out. And so this is now what Belinda's doing with research sources, right? She's focusing on what they all have in common, and she is not paying attention to the unique thing that each source offers, right? Super fascinating. In her discourse pattern, she's spiraling and chaining ideas, and that's showing up again orally and in her writing. For Lisa, Lisa's practically an activist by the time I meet her as a 12th grader. Her transnational experiences, her sensitivity to safety in institutions and in society have given her a lens at a much younger age than I started to develop something. So for her, the focus is activity, integration, and social change. Her discourse patterns, really tightly organized arguments. If I even ask her a simple interview question, she's gonna give me a straight answer and then support it with 3 examples, right? Like she's just on it. She explained that this is because her stepfather had different politics from her, and he was very passionate in his stances. And if she wanted to convince him of anything or even be able to participate in debate with him, she had to know how to present her argument, right? Because he was going to take it apart. So she had a built-in audience that prepared her for academic writing. So I'm not going to read all this with you, but I want you to notice with Belinda, when I talk to her about how do you understand this project, I beg you ask your students this sometimes, a handful that you're concerned about. So for Belinda, as she's talking about the senior exhibition project, what I saw is this focus on structure, how it's formatted. Okay, so for Belinda, she's all about structure, format, organization, fitting things into the paper in a certain way. It's not about communication for her, right? It's about, in high schools train many students, the high school rubrics that are used by teachers, you must contain these elements, right? It's not about communication. And because of that, given her own experiences outside of school, what she ended up fastening onto was just this notion of format. Now, when we move to Lisa, Lisa's all like, this is not just going to be a paper. Like, give me a break. That's silly. She said, you can make it something. Is this the first or the second? Nope. Yeah, here we go. She's like, it shouldn't be a report. It should be something that people can do. She knows there's a report with it, right? But this should be better than that. It should be bigger. You can actually change. You can put your name out there. You can represent who and what you are so the community is aware of it. It should be something that you can do. You have a lot of knowledge. Communicate it to other people. Take pride. Raise awareness. This young woman had something to communicate, right? Now, they all do. But we can't help them figure that out if we don't know their story, right? And they have to be safe to bring their story into our classroom. That's one of the first things that we need to work on, is just how do we invite the stories of our students so that we can identify and help them identify, what do you want to change? What do you want to communicate? How do we make this happen? And we're not going to guess it based on most of our lived experiences. Now moving into the more recent study, the ILP study with Jessica and Dominic. With this study, what I was not looking for, but was really amazed to see, I was initially looking for what are the language and literacy practices that they're using at home, that they're using at school, and that they're using at work, and what's the relationship between them. Are they leveraging their home literacies elsewhere or not, right? Where are the opportunities for that? Well, what I found is that these young people who were going to school from 8 to 4 because they have to go to work study one day a week, they were doing so much. I had a survey that just asked them, what do you do after school? What do you do on Saturdays? What do you do on Sundays? Ask this question. You don't have to do a survey, although I highly recommend it. Maybe do the survey after a little bit of trust or something, but ask this question. I also asked the question, in what ways do you help your families? And so what I learned is that these young people, 80-something% of them are language brokers for their families. They are interpreting for family members at least half once a week. At least half once a week, and then about 30% doing it daily for their families. This is a significant language and literacy practice. What's my target stop time?
1:30.
Okay, that works. So if we think about what is involved in interpreting for, language brokering with my dad and the landlord, and I imagine sort of, I've got a communication goal, my dad has a communication goal, so does the landlord. The power stakes are challenging, right? I don't have all the language to do this communication, but I have more English than my dad does. My dad might say some things that I know are gonna upset the landlord. So I have to mitigate that somehow if I want us to get our, family need met. So I'm doing all this problem solving while communicating. I'm thinking about audience. I'm thinking about context. I'm being really deliberate in my word choices. If I know, y'all probably realize that the landlord is not going to give me 10 minutes to explain everything that I need to explain. I have to be concise. I have to select information thoughtfully. I have to help my dad make this argument, and my dad doesn't talk that way, but I have more experience because I've been in these institutions and I bear this responsibility for my family. These young people have amazing skills that are so relevant for writing, organizing, supporting an argument, all of this, right? It's so compelling. So we saw this with Jessica and with Dominic. They both had really important skills to offer. So Jessica, on top of these routine family interpreting kinds of episodes, she also helped her dad at the front desk at his auto shop. And so she knew more English than most of the workers there, and so she would mediate some of that and do a lot of clerical work in answering phones. This is, again, as a 9th grader, right? Dominic was helping his dad. She also had her own puesto, selling things to get money to buy textbooks at UC Davis. Dominic here talks about how at home my work had always been split up between my sister and me, but ever since my sister left for college, everything sort of fell on me. I've become my dad's full-time translator, helping him with emails, texts, helping him studying for a professional licensing exam. He even had to figure out how to become licensed as a plumber to help his dad navigate all of that and then help him study. He helped with the invoicing. He did all the communications with the customer base, right? And that came out of nowhere for him when his sister left for college. So they've got these really sophisticated things that they're doing, and the story that we see come from this then is that, again, their lived experiences in family, language, and literacy practices made them outstanding researchers. It was amazing how easy it was as I got to know them, how I could leverage their skills into really advance things on the research team. However, these youth reported that no adults at school or work really knew them or understood their lives. Even the teachers they loved who loved them, they were like, yeah, but they have no idea what my life is like. No idea at all. And they felt like their talents were unwelcome in the classroom and in the workplace because they were not known, right? And it was dismissed. You have to make time for this, right? They'd have the demands and the compliance, but no sense of what was going on in their lives and how that gave them skills. So these are the skills that these young people, right? These high school students into undergrad years, they presented at twice for the Assembly for Research of the National Council of Teachers of English. They were lead presenters on 2 of these papers. They had papers accepted at the American Educational Research Association, which is a massive, it's the big education conference. Unfortunately, that one was canceled due to COVID that spring, but their papers were accepted. I want you to see this. So I ended up working with the high school to assign a paper called the Helper Essay. So we asked students, in what ways are you helpers in your homes, in your families and communities? And had them map them out and then say, what skills do you need to use to perform any of those helper roles? Now, in this, we weren't just looking at language and writing skills, but we could easily adapt that for a writing classroom, right? So how are you using writing? And don't just focus on writing, focus on oral language too, because that brings skills we can use in the service of writing. So I have one from Jacinta here. So you see, Jacinta has us working with my grandparents on weekends like it's nothing. Communication in person, also the phone. Her grandparents manage an apartment complex. She needs to write the eviction notices on behalf of her grandparents and manage those phone calls, right? This young woman has very sophisticated, at a very young age, language and literacy skills. And so I'm going to give you access to this later. I'm not going to walk us through it. But I have a publication that's not yet submitted, but I'm happy to share, where I map out all the forms of work that these 4 young people do and the underlying communication, problem solving, and literacy skills that they need to engage to perform these different kinds of work tasks, whether it's caregiving. Many are taking care of siblings as essentially primary caregivers, or these other kinds of job responsibilities that they have affiliated with family members. Understanding what those skills are tells us, and once we know what the skill is, we don't say, you have the skill, you know how to do a web search. No, we ask lots of questions. How do you use it? When do you use it? What's it for? What do you struggle with? What would you like to be able to do better when you're figuring out how to go up a level on Fortnite by looking at YouTube videos, right? Because, there's always something that motivates every single one. So we explore and ask, and once we get at their why, then we bring that into the writing context also. Okay, so what you learn here with me, that's going to help you get better at Fortnite too. Like, how cool is that? Because when we think about how we're looking at information, it can apply across context. So I ain't going to put you through that. Okay, so now I want to give you some examples in the classroom of what would we do with writing using some of this information. I'll apologize that my examples are mostly high school based out of the settings that I've been in, but you're very smart and I know you can make the leap. So when I was teaching in San Leandro, I had a lot of students with gang affiliations, particularly my Mexican immigrant kids in the Sureños. And it took me a couple years to kind of study up because I needed to build trust to figure out what that meant. One of the ways I built trust was we were doing literary analysis. And I played the song, Tracy Chapman's song, Bang, Bang, Bang. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. I passed around the CD. And of course, they mocked the image, like, this is not my music, the whole thing. But when we dug into the song lyrics and we read it as poetry, in this song, she deals with, it's the what you gonna do. The whole song is about a young person who's holding a gun, but then talks about how society put it there. And so it really digs into the complexities. It sets the context for nobody chooses to be a gangbanger, un pandillero, right? Like, nobody chooses that life. You are set up into it. And many kids want to get out of it, and they have no mechanism to do so. And so this song, as soon as I played it, we analyzed it for literary devices. We looked at the imagery, right? We looked at, like, a lot of the content that was part of my ELA curriculum. But as soon as we did that, my kids knew she gets something that most of my teachers don't. And I can say things in here that I can't say in other classrooms. And they could bring a bigger part of themselves into that space, right? I had them watch the video, and I could easily imagine doing this as homework. My family, again, this is so dated, right? It's 100 years ago. But I love this video about sort of an immigrant experience, and of course, Jimmy Smith's. To examine character development in relationship to social and historical context, but with the lived realities that a lot of my students were dealing with at the time. Same thing then, did I miss? Oh yeah, Romeo and Juliet. I was thinking there's so much of this Romeo and Juliet, and you will have other works of literature if some of you are focusing on that. But even there, the inflexibility of social groups and being able to cross social groups, I can see that making connections with kids who either have experiences with gang affiliation, navigating between cultures, especially with the immigrant experience. There's different ways that I could imagine using that. And anytime you bring in literature, y'all probably know this, but you don't have to read the whole thing, right? You can read 3 pages to make your point, do some analysis and do a thing. I think some of us forget that. The lab report, if we're working with disciplinary writing and we're trying to help kids figure that out, give an assignment, use the scientific method to follow a procedure at home, changing one ingredient or material, and then hypothesize about what the outcome will be and how you can write that up. And so students could do this with cosmetic or hair TikTok videos. They could do it with a cooking or baking show, making music or art from a tutorial, repairing an item, with, again, some kind of YouTube video. Expository text in the disciplines, explaining the relationship between X and Y or causes of X during Y period or whatever, this kind of thing. If our instructional goal here is to streamline argument and evidence, be as linear as possible in your explanation, well, this gets at the landlord thing, right? So imagine you are language brokering for your parents, or for folks who've had both experiences. I have been shocked to see the degree to which I share experiences with my language broker students and the ways I mediate communication for my parents with dementia, right? There's a lot of similarities there, which is interesting. And so some other students might have that experience. If you have students who aren't language brokers, guess what? They're not the expert in this one. They get to support the experts, and we have elevated the status in a classroom of students who often have the lower status. So that is just fine. So imagine you're language brokering for the landlord, the ceiling light fell to the ground and your family doesn't want to be charged. They want her to fix it. In groups, invent the crazy story about how the light fell down. That's the fun part. You're only allowed 5 minutes. Now, without lying, decide exactly what to tell the landlord to achieve your communication goal, and how to say it as concisely as possible. This, for argument, kids will get, young people will get, that the less you say, the less they will pick up on and twist on you, right? So if you try to give a big, elaborate story to the landlord, they're going to find holes. They're going to find things to negotiate. And our young people in these positions, they've experienced this, right? Over and over. They've learned this. Well, that understanding is so helpful for figuring out what to include or exclude as we are developing an argument in writing. Look through it. Imagine that landlord, right? And so that's what we're going to transition into writing from that piece. Another thing, evaluating information and research sources. So I talked about the experience of Belinda's mom, recruiting information from the community. So let's have students actually imagine that, right? So you need to know you don't speak much English yet. You're still working on it. But you're helping mom who's working 2 shifts. You need to know what school your sister will attend and how to get her support for a disability. So this is high stakes and is not simple information, right? So how do you go about this? You called some schools and you either got voicemail or you got some receptionist talking really fast in English, and it just didn't work, right? So who are you going to ask? How do you know which people will have the best information? How do you evaluate your sources? How do you know what information gathered is most important, which is most trustworthy? Now we're evaluating information. We need to know how to do this with our academic sources as well. We've had experience in our daily lives doing this. Our students with the least academic preparation still have had experience with this. Now your mom's exhausted when she gets back from night shift. You got 3 minutes to report on everything, right? So with only 3 minutes to report to her, what decisions do you make about what and how to share the information? Think about that process. Now let's think about that process as we move into our research assignment and that I'm going to introduce to you now, right? So this is the idea of leveraging. You've got to know their story, help them realize their skills in it, and then help transfer that into the processes of writing. And so the big idea then is just that we can't be teachers, hold this up, we can't be teachers of writing. It doesn't work. We have to be teachers of humans. And we can't be teachers of humans if we don't understand their human experience. So we've got to learn together, right? Learn a few experiences and discourse patterns. I can send you 2 or 3 articles that can give you a sense of here are some common things that you can assume you can build on in your classrooms. But then elicit something from students every day. And this is where the handout on the back has some ideas. So I always start my academic term with open response surveys, and I fill it out and post it for my students to read also. I believe that reciprocity is really important if I want to create safety. And I'll put, if I'm really struggling with my son at the time or, whatever it is, like I'm going to be vulnerable. So some of this you can put in a survey, again, asking them. I always, at the beginning of every course, have a survey that has the question, describe any of your identities or community affiliations that will shape your experiences of safety and learning in our classroom. So that one, and then what can your instructor and peers do to show respect and support for you? So that one I find super important. But then I might say, tell me what you do on Saturdays. What do you do on a typical Sunday? What do you do when you see your family? How do you help your family? Or we have so many students, you already know this, who are still, they might be 300 miles away from their families, but they're still responsible for supporting their families with every legal action, every major medical challenge, every institutional contact, and that's a lot to bear, right? So we want to know what some of those things are, and we want to know what is the problem solving and communication that they do when they're doing that. So this will give you some ideas of questions to ask. Some you can do as a survey, some you can do as a ticket out, right? So a ticket out is you literally just have them, you can do it, of course, on Canvas or whatever you use also as like a poll, but or a quiz, I don't know. But you can also just have a scrap of paper and you say, like, okay, what, who relies on you the most in your family? Maybe that's just the question you ask. Who relies on you the most? And what's one thing you do for them? And they take 1 minute to fill that out. You don't need to know who's who. And they hand it to you as they leave the room, right? The other thing that I have on here for some things that I have used a lot in the past is this have you ever checklist. I don't even know where I learned about it. I've never met anyone who's heard of it. But the idea is that you have typically about 10 questions, yes, no questions on one side of a piece of paper. If they're going to be reading something, you might have a few of the questions be related to the themes of that reading. You might also have some questions related to their own experiences and skills as readers. What about reading? Again, since it's a have you ever, one of the questions might be, I struggle to stay awake when I'm reading. Have you ever fallen asleep while reading? Yes, no. And then they're supposed to pick 3 of them and write on the back a little bit more detail for you. And so this is one that you would want their names on it. So I have some examples here of, have you ever lost an argument because you couldn't come up with evidence that the other person found compelling, right? Have you ever struggled to explain how you're feeling because you have so much to say and can't figure out where to start? Like, these are really relevant for writing. Have you ever followed instructions in a recipe or a YouTube tutorial and had your outcome be completely different? Or not known how to address someone in an email or in person because your relationship is ambiguous. Again, we're thinking about audience and how do we know the audience and how do we know how to address the audience, right? And so these are just little conversation starters when it comes to something like this that helps set the stage as we move into instruction. But there are other times where they're higher stakes. So when I was a high school teacher, I was teaching Cry the Beloved Country. I love that book. So I was teaching Cry the Beloved Country, which is the last thing I'll say before questions. And it's about a pastor, an African-American Episcopal pastor, the white son, the progressive white, okay, so the he's African, not African-American. African pastor has a son who goes to the city and through a variety of circumstances ends up killing a white guy. Turns out the white guy is an activist for racial justice, who is the son of a white bigot, who's the neighbor of the pastor. So there's the circle, right? So I want to know a bunch of things for my students to set them up for this. And one of the questions that I asked some things about race, of course, but I also asked, have you ever lost someone that you loved to violence? And 1/3 of my students marked yes. And almost all of them wrote on the back who they had lost and what the circumstances were. I had to know that moving into this novel with them, right? Like, I really needed to know that to be sensitive with how I handled that, and I never would have imagined it. So some of these things can give us really important information about our students and as we move into it, more and more safety and trust are built if we are cautious about what we do with it, and we make sure they know that they are valued and that they're safe there. So I'm gonna close it with that. Questions? I'm digging the AC. I brought a sweater in case it was too air conditioned. Yeah.
So, I've been teaching writing for 20 years. I have a lot of students. I have a series of assignments that I've used to good effect for 20 years.
Yep.
How do I begin to orient differently?
Yeah. Pick one. So I would say, yeah. So the first thing I would do is I would pick one assignment every term that I am going to work on shifting with some of these activities beforehand. But truthfully, you can't do the activities beforehand until you get to know the kids. So what you can do from the bat is start to get to know your students with surveys, with homework assignments that just invite something more about their lived experiences. Again, ticket out, some informal, as soon as they know that what they bring has skills. So that would be the other thing that I would do is when we did the first year seminar for students who were bilingual, and they read about language brokering as a sophisticated linguistic skill, they suddenly felt like they felt like they belonged in the university more, right? Because this is published stuff. They had no idea that what they were doing took so much cognitive work. They didn't know, it was just a part of everyday life. So I would say incorporating 1 or 2 readings that help students to see the skills in themselves, not just culturally relevant literature, right? But I'm talking about social science that says you're a rock star. And I can help provide some of that stuff to you if that's helpful. But I would say start there and try to have one assignment that they do out of that reading. And that one thing could make a world of difference for a lot of students. The next thing is elicit information. A lot of the information we get by being vulnerable, and I know that is not everybody's comfortable thing to do. But when I say be vulnerable, they don't need to know that I need to put my dad in a home this weekend. But I can say, I have so much responsibility towards my dad right now. I'm his primary caregiver, and it's really hard right now. That right there lets them know, I have to take care of my abuelito, and I've got to go help my uncle with this appointment. I get it. And then they come up to me after class, and they're like, I get it. So just sharing a generalization around something that you're dealing with helps them to see, you value the human experience. You have it too. Almost none of their professors show that, right? So having just something little, if you're not comfortable with sharing something that you're experiencing now, and plenty of people aren't, you can still think about earlier struggles that you've had, that you've managed as a young person or when you were in college or something, and try to bring those stories in. Or like, oh my gosh, I'm giving a keynote and I still get nervous. I'm so worried about timing. I'm worried about whatever. But for me to say, I've written, I've published all these articles. Writing is hard and I don't feel like doing it right now and I have to, right? Even just telling my students that, I'm supposed to write and I don't want to do it and I have to do it. How am I going to manage this? How do you all manage it? Let's talk about this, right? Here are some strategies that have worked for me. So it's a range of things like that. But yes, elicit information from them, be vulnerable, include a reading that builds them up. Yeah.
Are there certain formats for eliciting information and stories that work better than others? Or could you suggest that maybe like the way you set up what writing class versus out class?
Yeah. So I have had pretty decent success with the surveys. And so I send the You Belong statement and my first survey before our first class, right before classes start. And I fill it out myself first and send it as an example. And one of the questions I have on there is, how are you doing right now, really? And so I'm not necessarily saying, give me your trauma, right? But it lets them know I care about them as a human right there. And then I share one thing that I'm comfortable sharing as I write up my thing, and that is helpful. I would say having a writing assignment that actually gets them to dig into their own histories and experience. I'm fortunate in that I'm not teaching first year comp, I'm teaching cultural diversity as a writing intensive class. And so I have them respond. In their writing, they need to connect their lived experience to what we're reading in the literature as well as the theories that we're seeing. And so I get their stories, their personal narratives connected with the concepts that we're using in class, and that works really well. Some of it is also just informal. So I had a situation where for 3 years, I didn't have any Black students in my cultural diversity class. Which is not that unusual. We really don't have that demographic much. We're mostly, Hispanic serving institution, et cetera. But I was like, oh, I'm missing, what is this, right? And so I had a year where I had 3 African-American students, and I was like, you know what, I want to take you to lunch. I just want to know more about your experience at this university. And I want to know a little bit more about you, and you can ask me anything. But I'm asking because I care about you and I want to support you. I'm impressed by you, and I want to learn from you. And so sometimes it's as simple as that. Other things that I do to get to know students is as we develop this kind of relationship, they invite me to stuff. So in terms of diversity, the area in which I was slowest to engage and really understand had to do with trans and genderqueer students, and so I had some students in my class invite me to a campus event one weekend. At the time, I had 3-year-old toddlers, and I was like, I don't know, but I can see that this is important, not just because it was important to them, but because I lacked expertise that I needed in order to teach this class on diversity appropriately. And so they were like, we'll watch your toddlers, bring them. And I did, right? I brought my toddlers. I learned a lot at the event. I built relationship. My name ended up on some list. And so now that class, the last time I taught that class, 1/3 of the students were genderqueer. So safety spreads, word of mouth spreads when you're someone that students are safe with. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort. It's a lens change. And it's so much more fun than teaching writing. Teaching humans how to communicate what they want to in writing and be effective at it is so much more fun than teaching genre, right? And you learn so much, and it's exciting. You never know kind of what you're going to get from term to term, and you stretch, but you're stretching with students like, those classes where you feel like the students are sharks circling, trying to like catch you at something, or like it changes the dynamic so much when you have a class where the students are like, yeah, it's okay. Like, we know that you're kind of, you screwed up the slides today, but we get it, right? Like, they're actually your champions as you shift the culture in the classroom in these ways, and it's so much fun.